She knocked on 12 doors in the freezing cold. Only the rancher at the 13th let her in. A homeless freezing woman knocked on 12 doors. The 13th belonged to a rancher and he let her in. This is not just a tale of kindness, but a deep look at what it means to be truly seen when all you have been is judged. The cold was not a new acquaintance. It had been Ilara Vance's constant, unforgiving companion for 4 months. It had gnawed at her, followed her, and now, as the wind rose into a bitter gale, it threatened to consume her entirely. Each step on the narrow ridge trail was a battle. A new gust of wind slammed into her, a physical blow that staggered her, threatening to send her tumbling from the narrow path. She wrapped her arms tighter around her chest, a futile attempt to hold the torn deerskin shawl against her body. The brittle, cracking hide offered no warmth, only a flimsy shield against the biting air that found every tear and gap. Below the hems of her tattered dress, her feet were raw. The rags and twine she had tied around them for protection were soaked through with melting snow and the constant seeping blood from the cracks in her skin. Each footfall sent a jolt of searing pain from her heels to her spine, a relentless percussion of misery. Her body was a symphony of aches and tremors, shivering so violently her teeth chattered, rattling in her jaw. The dress, once a soft blue prairie gown, was a ghost of its former self, a threadbare ruin. The neckline, stretched and torn from wear and cold, hung loose, exposing the pale curve of her chest to the elements. The skirt, ripped up one side days ago on a splintered fence post, now flapped with every weary step, bearing her thigh to the wind. Shame was a luxury she had long ago discarded. Modesty was for people who weren't starving, for those who weren't teetering on the edge of extinction. She didn't care who saw her, who judged her. She only cared about one thing: survival. She had knocked on 12 doors already. 12. The rejections were etched in her mind, each one a fresh wound on her spirit. The first rancher, a heavy-set man with a sour face, had peered at her through a crack in the door and muttered something about harlots and sinners before slamming the wood in her face. The second had unlatched his dogs, a pair of lean, snarling curs that had barked and lunged at her until she stumbled backward into the deep snow. The others hadn't even bothered with words. They had either slammed their doors without a glance, or stared at her from the safety of their window panes, their faces impassive, or filled with a cold, righteous disgust that was far more painful than the dog's barks. Their judgment was a tangible thing, a weight she carried with every painful step. Ilara had been cast out by the man who once called her wife 4 months ago. Pastor Eamon, a traveling preacher, had been a man of fire and brimstone in his sermons, but of cowardice and cruelty in his heart. She had committed no sin. But in one tight-knit settlement, 2 young men had shown a passing interest in her. Instead of defending her, Eamon had accused her. He called her a temptation, a seductress, and declared her an instrument of the devil. He packed his few belongings, left her on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back, and told the stunned townsfolk that she wasn't his problem anymore. With no family, no money, and not a single soul willing to stand up for her, she had been walking ever since a human pariah, banished from every doorstep. Just as her hope began to crystallize into despair, the wind shifted. With it came the faintest scent of smoke, not the sweet smell of burning pine, but the dry, earthy smell of old hardwood. It was a promise, a beacon that pulled her forward. The scent came from somewhere just beyond the bend, past a broken fence post and a weathered line of split rails that looked like they had been standing since the war. Ignoring the ache in her knees and the churning sickness in her gut, she followed the promise of warmth. The gate, a sagging and splintered thing, creaked mournfully as she pushed it open. There was no sound from the house, just the steady curl of smoke from the chimney, and a faint buttery glow of firelight behind warped window panes. The place was isolated, set apart from the other ranches. She had passed a lonely rock amidst the trees. There were no livestock in sight, no chickens scratching at the hard ground, no sign of life save for the faint flicker within. Ilara hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the frame. This was the 13th door, the final door. She didn't expect anything different. She knew how this would go. She'd be met with the same cold eyes, the same silent judgment. She knocked twice the sound, a feeble tap against the heavy wood, her knuckles too swollen and raw to hit any harder. Then once more, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, frantic drum. Not from hope, but from a profound and terrible dread. The dread of another rejection, the certainty of another long walk through the snow until her legs finally gave out and she lay down to freeze. And then she heard it. The dull, heavy clunk of a latch sliding open. The sound was slow and deliberate, a movement that held no urgency. The door creaked, revealing the man inside. Silas Thorne, a man of 42, stood there. He was a former Union scout, though no one in these parts remembered that now. He had lost his wife to pneumonia and his 6-year-old boy to fever in the same brutal winter. Since then, he had lived in that house, speaking little to anyone, a human ghost. A few folks in town still tried to hire him for fencing or timber work, but he rarely came into town anymore. His house sat like a rock among the trees, untouched, shut off from the world. Alara knew none of this, but she could read something in the way he looked at her. He was tall, solid, his shoulders thick from years of work. He wore a heavy brown coat still dusted with snow and a thick beard that had not seen a razor in weeks. His eyes were shadowed, tired, almost hollow, but they were alert. She braced herself for the look of disgust, the crude appraisal, the cold curiosity. Instead, he simply looked at her face, then at her raw, bare feet, and then back to her face. Neither of them spoke. Alara tried to stand tall, but her legs were shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know what he saw. Perhaps just a ruined woman, her low-cut dress clinging to her like a second cold skin, bruises darkening her arms, and nothing left to beg with but her broken presence. She swallowed hard, her throat dry and constricted. When she spoke, her voice was a raspy whisper, barely a sound at all. "I'm cold." Silas didn't answer. His hand, resting on the doorframe, flexed slightly. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and then he stepped back. That was it. No words, no invitation, just space. He was offering her the option to enter. She took a step, and her legs nearly gave out on her. She caught herself on the doorframe, leaning against it, breathing in the warm, thick air. The smell of wood smoke, old timber, and a simmering stew was a heady perfume of life. Her whole body sagged with the sudden release of tension. Silas moved past her in silence. She noticed his limp immediately, his right leg dragging slightly, his boot scraping against the plank floor. He knelt by the hearth, pulled a folded blanket from a nearby crate, and walked it over to her. He didn't unfold it. He simply set it on the chair beside the doorway. Then he returned to the fire. The inside of the cabin was plain, rugged, and spare. Heavy beams, thick stone. The hearth took up most of one wall. A bed was tucked behind a curtain at the back. A table held 2 chairs, though one looked untouched, unused for years. Alara didn't speak. She didn't sit in the chair. She stood until the pins and needles in her legs gave way, then lowered herself to the floor near the hearth. She pulled the blanket around her and held it tightly, but her body was still shaking. She was trying to stop, to get control, but she couldn't. She had made it. She was inside. She should have felt relief, but all she felt was a profound, biting shame. The front of her dress had come loose as she knelt, and she was too exhausted to fix it. The tops of her breasts were exposed, rising and falling with every panicked, shuddering breath. She caught Silas looking once. He wasn't leering or lustful. His gaze was hesitant, almost lost, like a man who hadn't seen another person in years and didn't know if he was even allowed to look. He stood and went to the stove, ladled something thick into a tin bowl, and set it on the floor nearer to her. Then he grabbed a second blanket from a hook on the wall, dropped it beside the first, and sat in the far chair facing the fire. They sat like that for a long time. She ate slowly, messily, with both hands cupped around the warm bowl. He watched the flames. When she was finished, she set the empty bowl down and leaned against the warm stone of the hearth. "Thank you," she said, her voice a quiet, fragile thing. Still, he said nothing. But he hadn't shut the door. The fire burned low by the time Alara stirred again. Silas hadn't moved from his chair. He sat hunched slightly forward, forearms resting on his thighs, fingers laced together, a still sentinel watching the flames. He wasn't asleep. He hadn't so much as closed his eyes since she walked through the door. Alara lay curled in the corner nearest the hearth, wrapped in both wool blankets. Her wet dress clung to her leg beneath the thick layers. She had stopped shaking at some point, but her body still twitched now and then, the kind of involuntary spasms that came when warmth returned after too long in the cold. She opened her eyes slowly, taking in the room again. Bare walls, pegs lined with tools, a bucket of firewood. No shelves, no books, no sign of another person's life. She looked toward the back curtain. It was still drawn. Whatever lay behind it, Silas hadn't touched it. Alara sat up slightly, one blanket falling from her shoulder. The fabric of her dress had dried, unevenly crusted, in places still damp in others. The neckline sagged low, exposing the upper swell of her chest, but Silas didn't look. He was staring into the fire again, his jaw tight. She pulled the blanket back up. Not out of shame, she was past that, but because the air still bit where it could reach her skin. "Is this your house?" she asked softly. Silas looked at her for the first time since she'd come in, giving a single short nod. "Do you live alone?" A pause, then another nod. Alara drew her knees and hugging them beneath the wool. She didn't press further. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. A man who opened his door in the middle of a storm after 12 others. Couldn't be ordinary, but there was something about his silence that wasn't cruel. He was listening, just choosing not to speak. She glanced toward the hearth again, where her empty bowl sat on the stone ledge. Her stomach had stopped cramping. That was the first real relief in days. "Why did you let me in?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. Silas's eyes flicked toward her. He didn't answer. He stood instead, his movements slow and deliberate. Alara caught the way his right leg dragged slightly, his knee stiff as he moved. Not a limp from that night, but an old one. A wound he'd learned to live with. He walked to the back wall and opened a trunk beside the curtain. After a moment's digging, he returned with a folded gray flannel shirt and a thick pair of old wool socks. He held them out to her without a word. Alara hesitated, then took them. His hand didn't touch hers. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. She changed behind the table. He turned his back without being asked. The shirt was coarse but warm, hanging past her hips and covering most of her thighs. She kept her own torn underdress beneath it. The socks were thick, almost too big, but they wrapped around her raw feet like heaven. She sat again near the firearms, folded around herself. It took a while before she spoke again. "My name's Alara." No reply. Alara Vance. Still nothing. Then finally a voice. Low, hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a long time. "Silas." She turned to look at him. "Silas Thorne," he added. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Silas." He gave no answer, but something in his jaw softened barely perceptibly. A long silence followed. The wind howled outside again, a banshee wail pushing against the walls. Somewhere distant, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. Alara flinched, then looked down at her hands. The fingertips were still tinged green from frost, but the tremor was gone. She looked at him again. "You're not married." Jonas didn't react at first. Then, after a moment, he reached into the crate by his chair and pulled out a tin mug. He poured hot water from the kettle near the hearth, added a pinch of dried something from a small pouch, and handed the steaming cup to her. "No," he said finally. She took it with both hands. The warmth made her throat tighten again, not from the heat, but from something else, a swelling that rose and sat behind her eyes. She didn't cry. Not yet. "You don't talk much," she said after a while, not accusing, just stating. Silas didn't respond. She sipped the drink. It was plain, just mint and hot water. But it was clean, comforting in a way she hadn't felt in weeks. "My husband left me," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "He was a preacher. We traveled. He said I made men stare too much. Said it was easier to leave me than deal with it." Silas didn't move. "They call me a temptation," she added. "The women stopped speaking to me. Then the men started showing up around camp. He said it was my fault." Her jaw clenched. Her eyes stayed on the mug. "He left me in Havenwood Ridge. I slept under a rail car the first night, then started walking." Another long silence. Silas didn't look away from the fire, but he didn't shift. He didn't leave. "I ain't asking for pity," Alara said. "Just don't want you thinking I'm here to rob you or spread lies." He finally turned his head. "I didn't ask," he said simply. She nodded. That was the end of it. She finished the tea, set the mug down, and pulled her legs up into the chair. Her bare thighs were warm now under the shirt. Her breathing slowed. "I'll leave tomorrow," she said. Silas didn't react. She looked at him, half hoping he would say something. Ask her to stay. Tell her it was fine. She didn't know what she wanted, but he only said storm won't pass by. She looked at the door. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it won't." Silas stood. He walked to the table, blew out the lamp, then crossed to the back curtain and disappeared behind it. Alara stayed in the chair by the fire. She didn't know if he was going to come back out, or if he'd lock the door behind him or tell her to leave at daylight. But there was a folded blanket near the hearth, a warm mug by her hand, a fire that hadn't gone out, and nobody had slammed a door in her face. She wrapped herself in both blankets and lay down on the rug. Sleep came slower this time, but it came not because she was safe, but because for the first time in weeks no one told her she wasn't welcome. And for now that was enough. The next morning broke slow and pale, filtered through clouded windows and the smoke drift from the hearth. The storm had eased in the night, but snow still clung to the trees and blanketed the earth outside in uneven drifts. Alara woke to the sound of boots on floorboards, not fast, just a steady 1-foot drag rhythm moving from the back of the cabin toward the stove. She blinked against the low light, her body sore from sleeping on the floor. The wool blankets were still wrapped around her, and she'd kept Silas's oversized flannel shirt on through the night. Her own dress, tattered and damp, was folded beside her, along with the socks she'd removed before bed. For a moment her mind tried to go back to other mornings. Warm sunlight through canvas tent flaps. Sermons being muttered over breakfast. The feeling of always being watched. But not here. Silas stood near the hearth, adding kindling to the fire. His coat was already on his hat, pushed low over his brow. His eyes flicked toward her just once before turning back to his task. He didn't speak. "Good morning, Alara," said quietly, her voice rough from sleep. He gave a single curt nod. Her stomach twisted not from nerves but from hunger, the kind of ache that made her legs feel hollow. "I didn't mean to take up your whole floor," she said, sitting up and pulling the blanket tighter over her chest. "It's fine," he said without looking. Alara hesitated, then, gathering the blanket under her arms, she stood and crossed the room barefoot. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. "Cook, sweep, feed, anything." Silas moved aside to let her near the stove. "Pot's warm. There's cornmeal and beans." She nodded. "I can cook." He stepped back and sat at the table as Alara began working, spooning soaked beans into a pan, stirring the cornmeal over the heat. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was silent again, but something in the set of his shoulders felt less guarded than the night before. "You live all the way out here by yourself?" she asked. "Not just to fill space, but to understand." He nodded. "You got family anywhere number?" She glanced back at him. His hands were clasped in front of him, resting on the edge of the table. His knuckles were broad, roughened from years of labor. "You were a soldier," she said quietly. "I saw the way your leg drags. That don't come from farm work." Silas looked up at her, then his gaze steady. "Yeah, Union." Another nod. "Your wife," Clara began, then stopped herself. Her voice softened. "She passed 3 winters ago," he said, his voice flat. "Fever took her. Boy too." Alara didn't speak. She just let the information settle in the air. So that's why the house was so still. Why the bed in the back hadn't been touched. Why he spoke like a man with nothing left to say. "I'm sorry," she said gently. He didn't respond. Alara returned to the stove. When the food was ready, she set 2 tin bowls on the table. They ate quietly, spoons scraping against metal. Alara didn't rush, didn't overstay the silence. She didn't cry, didn't ask more than he was willing to offer. She just stayed. When the bowls were empty, she stood again, took the dishes to the basin, and began washing them without being asked. Silas watched her. After a moment, he spoke. "Most folks don't make it far in that storm, not without shelter." Alara paused. "I would have died. I know that." She looked at him, then straight on. Her hair hung wild around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed from the fire. The shirt slid slightly along her collarbone, revealing more skin than it covered. But Silas didn't look away out of modesty. He looked because she was human again, not just some half-frozen thing on his doorstep. "I knocked on 12 doors before yours," she said. 12 men looked me in the eye and shut me out. Some of them knew my husband knew what he did. Didn't matter." Silas's jaw tensed. He said nothing, but his hands curled slightly into fists on the table. "I don't want to be anyone's problem," she added. "But I can work. You don't owe me anything, but if you let me stay through the snow, I'll earn it." Silas stood slowly and walked to the fire. He grabbed another log and fed it into the coals. The flames caught quick. "You can stay," he said without turning. "Long as you need." Alara felt something tighten in her chest, not sadness, not even relief. Something else, like the first breath after coming up from underwater. "Thank you," she said. He didn't nod, didn't speak again, just stirred the fire and returned to his chair. They sat again in silence. Later he pulled on his gloves and coat and told her simply, "I'll check the horses." She followed him to the door. The cold outside hit hard, but it was dry now. The sky was a dull gray overhead. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked to the shed. Alara watched from the doorway, one blanket wrapped over her shoulders. She could see it now, the pasture beyond mostly empty. The rail fencing needed fixing. The barn leaned slightly. The whole place looked like it had been kept just enough to survive, not thrive. Alara didn't know what kind of man Silas Thorne had been before. Before war, before loss, before silence. But she could see who he was now. And something in her gut said this place wasn't just where she landed. It might be the only place she could start again. Not because he saved her, but because he hadn't asked her to explain herself, because the door stayed open, and because even in his silence he saw her. Not as a burden, but as someone who still mattered. The following days passed without event, but not without meaning. Alara found herself waking before the sun pulled from sleep by the cold, in a habit she hadn't realized she'd built. Always rising before someone had the chance to tell her to move. But here, no one ever told her anything. Silas didn't give orders. He didn't ask much of anything. He simply let her be. She began working without being told. She swept the cabin floor each morning, fetched water from the well when her feet could stand it, and cleaned the stove after breakfast. She fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door using a rusted nail she found near the woodpile. She folded his laundry, though there wasn't much of it, just 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers, and his long johns. She didn't look too closely at those. Each night she cooked what she could with what little was there: beans, dried apples, cornmeal, salt pork. There were no luxuries, no spices, beyond what she could find in a sack beside the windowsill. But she made it warm and filling. Silas always ate everything she gave him. Never said it was good, never said it wasn't. But he kept eating, and that was enough. Ilara had questions, of course. Anyone would. About the woman whose sewing things still sat neatly packed in a box under the bed. About the boy whose carved wooden horse lay half buried in the snow behind the shed. About Silas's limp and how deep the scars really went. But she didn't ask. Not yet. On the 4th morning, she found him outside splitting logs before dawn, steam rising off his shoulders as the axe dropped again and again. He worked in a silent, focused rhythm, sweat glinting on his neck despite the cold. Ilara stood on the porch, arms folded over her borrowed coat. The coat was his too big, wool-lined, worn through one elbow, but it was the warmest thing she'd ever worn. She tugged it tighter around herself and stepped off the porch. "Can I help?" she asked. Silas paused. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He handed her a smaller hatchet from the stump nearby. "You ever split wood before?" he asked. "No," Ilara said. "But I can learn." He nodded once. He didn't tell her how to hold it. He didn't grab her hands or adjust her grip. He let her swing and miss the first time, then the second. By the 3rd strike, she managed to crack through a piece of pine. It was clumsy, but it worked. They spent an hour in silence, stacking the chopped wood in uneven piles. Later, back inside, her hands ached. Blisters were already rising on her palms. She sat by the stove, fingers stretched over the heat, biting down a grimace. Silas passed behind her, paused, and set something down beside her. She looked down. It was a half-used tin of what was probably lanolin, or bear fat mixed with beeswax. She didn't ask what was in it. Ilara met his eyes briefly. "Thank you." He nodded and turned away. That night after supper, Ilara stood near the fire while Silas washed up at the basin. The cabin was warm close. A windstorm had picked up outside, and snow scattered across the windows like tapping fingers. She spoke without looking at him. "Back in town," she said slowly, "some folks said your place was cursed. Said you'd gone strange after your family died. That no one comes out here anymore." Silas dried his hands on a rag and tossed it over the basin hook. "They're not wrong," he said. Ilara turned to him. "Then why'd you open the door?" Silas met her eyes for a moment, then shrugged slightly. Didn't see the point in letting someone die that close to the fire. His voice was dry, not cold, but tired. She watched the way his face barely moved when he spoke. It was the first full sentence she'd heard from him in days. She stepped closer. The fire cast shadows between them, warm light flickering against the walls. Most men would have still shut the door, she said. Silas didn't answer. They stood there for a moment, the silence hanging again. But it didn't feel empty this time. She took another step forward, not bold. Not forward in the way she'd once been accused of, but careful. Honest. "I know you don't owe me anything, and I know you didn't ask for me to stay." Silas exhaled slowly. "You're not a burden." The words caught her off guard. He said them plain simple, as if it were fact. Ilara blinked, and something stung at the corners of her eyes. Not from pity, but from how long it had been since someone said anything kind to her without wanting something in return. She looked down, then back up. "You don't know me." "I don't have to," Silas said. She stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of smoke on his coat. She reached out, hesitated, then gently touched the sleeve of his shirt. Silas didn't flinch. "I'll sleep on the floor again," she said softly. "But I'd rather not if it's all the same to you." He didn't move, but his voice came low. "There's room." He stepped past her and pulled the curtain aside. The bed wasn't large. It was simple, covered with thick woolen blankets and a single pillow. There were no signs of mourning in it now. Just a bed used, kept. Silas sat on the far edge, removed his boots, and lay back without a word. Ilara stood still for a long moment, then slipped out of the coat. Her dress underneath was worn, the neckline loose, the hem barely holding. She slid under the covers, fully clothed, leaving space between them. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. But in the stillness, in the sound of two people breathing together under the same roof without fear or shame, something old began to thaw. Silas closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't dream about what he'd lost. He dreamed about what hadn't left. The warmth that came from sharing a bed didn't mean they touched. Not yet. But the distance between them had lessened. Slowly, naturally, Silas lay on one side, face turned toward the wall, breathing evenly. Ilara lay on the other, curled beneath thick wool blankets, eyes open to the dark. The room was quiet except for the wind beyond the walls and the steady pop of firewood in the stove. She didn't sleep much that first night in his bed, not out of fear, but because her body didn't know how to relax beside someone and not brace for what came next. But nothing came. He didn't move toward her, didn't try to touch her. And by morning, when she finally closed her eyes for a short hour of sleep, she did so with her body still intact, her pride untouched, and her sense of self strangely still whole. Silas was already out of bed when she woke. She heard him chopping wood outside just as before. Ilara dressed slowly, layered herself in his flannel shirt again, and pulled her shawl around her shoulders before stepping outside. The cold hit harder than before. The storm had passed, but the air was sharp and dry. She squinted into the white light and saw him near the barn sleeves, rolled up, splitting timber with slow, even strikes. He paused when he saw her, gave a nod. "Morning," she said, her voice small. "You sleep a little." "Fire's warm," he said, simply pointing toward the house with his chin. She hesitated, then stepped off the porch and walked toward him. "I'm not just going to sit inside while you work," she said. He didn't argue. Instead, he passed her a bundle of thin logs and gestured to the shed. "Stack those by the door, not too close. Wind'll carry sparks." Ilara nodded and got to work. They labored side by side for nearly an hour, not saying much. The rhythm of its swing, split, carry, stack was enough to settle them both. Her hands burned from the friction. Her breath came out fast and hot, but it felt good to move. It felt good to be useful again. By midday, Silas handed her a tin cup of cold water from the well. She drank, wiped her mouth with her sleeve, and glanced at him. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He shook his head. "Left too many places already." "You lived in town before." He nodded once. "Years ago. Before." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Ilara understood. Before the fever, before the grave markers. Before silence took root in his chest and made him into the man who barely spoke anymore. "You never remarried?" she asked carefully. Silas looked at her, his eyes calm but clear. Didn't see the point. Ilara looked down, her thumb brushing the rim of her cup. "You ever miss it? Having someone in the house next to you?" A pause. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Other times it's quieter this way." She nodded. There were more questions she didn't ask. About what kind of husband he had been. About whether he had loved the woman before her. About what it meant that he hadn't touched her, hadn't asked for anything even now. But something in her gut told her the answer already. He wasn't a man who took. Later that day, Ilara brought out the rug from the hearth area and beat the dust from it with a stick behind the cabin. Silas mended the fence posts near the south slope. The chores weren't spoken, they just happened. Two bodies moving, fixing, surviving. That night she cooked salt pork and beans again. Silas sat at the table while she stirred. He didn't speak until she set the plate down. "You don't have to keep working like this," he said quietly. Ilara sat across from him. "I know." She picked up her fork, ate in silence, then looked up. "But I want to." He didn't smile, but there was a quiet in his eyes, not approval but acceptance. After dinner, she poured water into the basin and began washing. Silas dried each plate as she passed them. Their hands brushed once, just once. He didn't move. Neither did she. When it came time to sleep, they didn't talk about it. They simply walked behind the curtain together, laid down in the same bed, and pulled the blanket over both of them. This time Ilara moved a little closer. Close enough for their arms to touch, close enough to feel his warmth along her back. She didn't ask permission. Silas didn't pull away. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the day her husband had called her a problem to be solved. "Safe," she whispered into the quiet. "You don't know what this means." His voice was a low rasp in the dark. "You don't have to explain." And with that, the silence between them became something else entirely. It became a choice. By the sixth morning, Ilara no longer hesitated before stepping out of the bed they now quietly shared. There were still inches between them when they lay down, but they breathed in the same space, exhaled into the same stillness, and she no longer flinched when his hand brushed hers under the blanket. Silas rose early as always. But this time when Ilara sat up and began pulling on her boots, he paused by the doorway and looked at her directly. "I'm riding to town today," he said. She blinked, adjusting the flannel shirt she'd taken to wearing like a second skin. "Do you go often?" He shook his head. Only when the feed runs low. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You said you didn't like town. I don't, Silas replied, tugging on his gloves. But I need oats and salt. She stood. I'll come. He hesitated. It wasn't a look of rejection, more like concern. He studied her for a moment, then finally gave a nod. They rode in silence. Silas had a stout bay mare with a slow, steady gait. Alara rode behind him on a mule wrapped in the heavy coat he'd loaned her. The trail was frozen hard, the snow pressed thin along the narrow path that cut down a hollow's bluff. Alara hadn't seen the town in months, and even then she'd only passed through on foot. Now from atop the mule, she could see everything she hadn't noticed before: the sun-bleached clapboard front of the general store, the sagging saloon porch, the row of hitching posts darkened from decades of dust and blood. Heavenwood Ridge was small, no more than 30 or 40 people who came and went depending on season and trade. But every pair of eyes in it turned when she rode in beside Silas Thorne. She could feel their gaze on her. The women on the mercantile porch, the old man outside the livery, even a boy sweeping snow from the jail steps. They didn't wave, didn't greet her. They looked and some whispered. Silas didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. He dismounted and led the mule toward the feed store. Alara stayed close, shoulders drawn in, head low. Inside the store was warmer, filled with the dry scent of grain and canvas sacks. Silas spoke briefly to the clerk, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a faded vest. The man looked at Alara once, then said nothing more. The interaction was quick, efficient. Silas had likely done this the same way for years, but before they left, a voice called out from behind them. You pick her up off the road, Silas. It was a man's voice, mocking young. Alara turned slowly. A man leaned against the edge of a barrel near the back of the store, maybe late 20s, wearing a dusty brown duster and a crooked grin. She didn't know his name, but the way he looked at her said enough. Silas didn't turn. Sure don't look like your wife, the man added. She knew stock. Silas turned then slowly. Say that again, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. The man shrugged, still smiling, but Alara saw the twitch in his fingers. Just asking if she's your cook or your... The clerk moved between them, his voice gruff. That's enough, Cal. You want to keep your teeth, get out of here. The man lingered for a breath, his eyes flicking to Alara with something between disgust and curiosity. Then he turned and left the door slamming behind him. Silas didn't look at Alara. He just turned to the clerk, handed over coin, and picked up the feed sack. They walked out in silence. Silas loaded the mule while Alara stood near the post, her stomach tight and cold. Not from fear, but from a shame she thought was long gone. When they were halfway up the trail back home, she finally spoke. You should have let him say it, she said quietly. It's what they all think anyway. Silas didn't answer. She kept going. They think I'm sleeping with you for warmth, for food. That I begged my way into your bed. You didn't, Silas said simply. Alara looked at him, her eyes hard. But they don't care about the truth. He pulled the mule to a stop and turned in the saddle. I don't give a damn what they think, he said, his voice not raised but resonating with authority. It didn't need to be said. She stared at him, her breath visible between them. Then she looked away. I just didn't want you to be shamed for taking me in. Silas leaned slightly toward her. I took you in because you were cold and near dead. You stayed because you work harder than most men I know. That's not shame, she swallowed. The wind kicked up around them again. Do you want me to leave, she asked suddenly and directly. Silas's brow furrowed. No, he said, and for the first time there was a genuine expression on his face. Even if they talk, let 'em. They rode the rest of the way in silence. That night Alara didn't sleep on her edge of the bed. She curled in close beside him, her back against his chest, her hips resting against his thighs. She didn't ask, didn't wait. She simply let her body move where it wanted. Silas's arm slid around her waist. No words, no rush, just warmth, steady breath, and the quiet understanding between two people who'd already been through enough judgment to know the difference between survival and shame. That night, no one reached for more than was offered, but no one pulled away either. And in a place where doors had once slammed on her like punishment, Alara had now found herself leaning back into a man who hadn't spoken 20 words on the way home but had given her more peace than a sermon ever had. The air shifted in the weeks that followed. The snow didn't melt, but the light changed softer at the edges, longer in the mornings. Spring was still a ways off, but it was close enough that the birds started calling again at dawn. Silas began clearing the back fence where the drift had buried the lower rails, and Alara planted onion bulbs along the edge of the shed in soil still half frozen. They didn't say it aloud, but they both knew it. They'd made it through the worst of winter. The routines between them settled into something unspoken. She cooked. He chopped wood. She mended his shirt cuffs. He filled the water basin without her asking. They didn't talk about sharing the bed anymore. It had become the only bed. The blankets were no longer pulled between them. His hand sometimes rested on her hip as they slept. Her foot sometimes brushed his leg beneath the covers and stayed there. One evening after supper, Ilara sat at the table brushing out her hair. It had grown tangled during the stormy weeks, and now that she had time to breathe, she began tending to it again. Silas watched her from his chair near the fire. His gaze wasn't intense, just steady, as if each movement she made slow and methodical reminded him she was real and still here. "Why haven't you asked me to leave?" she asked quietly, not looking up. Silas didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, his legs stretched out. "Would it matter if I had?" he asked. Ilara turned slightly. "It would." Silas nodded once. "Then I won't." She smiled a little, but it faded just as fast. "What if someone comes looking? My husband might not be in town, but he's out there. He still preaches. Men like him, they find ways to punish what they couldn't control." Silas's jaw flexed, but he stayed still. "You think he'd come for you?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but if he knew where I was, he wouldn't stay away." Silas stood slowly and crossed to the small cabinet near the door. He pulled a revolver from a drawer. Not in threat, not for show. He set it on the table between them and looked at her. "I don't scare easy," he said. "And I don't let go of what's mine." Ilara froze. The words weren't loud. They weren't romantic, but they landed with a terrible weight. She stared at the revolver, then at him. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice not trembling. He nodded. "Not unless you say so." Another pause. Then she leaned forward, her hand reaching for his, not the gun. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered. Silas held her hand, his rough fingers, his warm grip. They sat there, palms pressed together, the fire cracking behind them. That night, when they climbed in bed, Ilara undressed first. Slowly, there was no performance in it, no dramatics. She removed the shirt, the worn shift underneath, until she was bare beneath the quilt. Her body was scarred in places, faint lines across her ribs, small bruises near her hips that had taken months to fade. Her curves were full soft, the winter's meals having returned flesh to where there had been only bone. She didn't hide from him. Not anymore. Silas sat on the bed's edge and removed his boots, his shirt, his trousers. He was lean, worn down by years of labor and grief, but his body was strong, still capable. A long, pale scar ran along his right thigh where a musket ball had torn through during the war. He didn't cover it when he joined her beneath the covers. Their bodies didn't clash. They aligned like something that had been waiting to fit again. His hands moved slow, one at her cheek, one down her side. He kissed her, not hungrily but deeply, like a man who hadn't touched warmth in a long time and didn't want to break it. Ilara kissed him back, her arms circling his shoulders, her breath catching as his mouth moved to her neck, her collarbone, her chest. They didn't rush. There was no fear, no apology, only need, honest and quiet. When they came together, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Afterward, she lay against him, her cheek on his chest, listening to the steady beat of a man who hadn't asked for her past, hadn't demanded her future. "You don't need to say anything," she said, her eyes closed. "I won't," he replied. But he held her tighter, and she didn't cry, but she wanted to. Not from sadness. From knowing for the first time in years what it felt like to be wanted without being owned. Outside, snow fell again, light silent. But the inside of the cabin was warm. And for the first time, Ilara stopped counting how many doors she had knocked on, because she'd found the one that stayed open. The days stretched longer now. The sun lingered later behind the ridge, casting soft gold across the pine-covered slope behind the house. Snow remained in patches, but the ground was beginning to show through. Mud replaced ice on the trails. Small green shoots broke through the earth near the shed where Ilara had pressed bulbs into frozen soil weeks earlier. Life stubborn as it was returned. So did routine. Silas repaired the fence line out back. Ilara hung linens and shirts to dry in the breeze. They no longer worked beside each other in silence. They spoke now, not often, but enough. Words came when they needed to, about chores, weather mules, the little things. The heavier things still came slower, but they didn't need to be forced. At night, they shared the bed as though it had always been that way. The distance between their bodies was gone now. He kissed her softly when he came in from the cold. She curled into him when the wind howled at night. Their intimacy had no ceremony to it, no declaration. It came naturally, like water finding its course. But with comfort came questions, not from him, but from Ilara herself. It happened one evening after supper. She stood at the basin scrubbing a pan. Silas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching her. She was humming. Nothing tuneful, just something simple, probably from childhood. Her sleeves were rolled and a bit of her chest showed where the neckline of her worn prairie dress dipped. The fabric stretched loose from time and repeated washing. She caught him looking. She always did. But this time, instead of looking away, she turned to face him fully. "You going to keep staring or finally say what's on your mind?" she asked, half a smile tugging at her lip. Silas didn't blink. "You planning to stay?" Alara froze. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because someone had finally asked. "I haven't thought about it," she lied. He didn't move, didn't press. She dried her hands, wiping them along the sides of her dress. "Truth is, I don't have anywhere else to go. I wouldn't know where to start. I used to think about leaving, trying to get far enough that I could make a name without anyone knowing what I've been." Silas shifted his stance, still watching her. "But this house," she paused. It doesn't feel like running anymore." Silas stepped forward, not fast, just enough to close the space between them. "You're not someone I took in," he said. "You're someone who walked through the door and made the place feel alive again." Alara looked up at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then say it." Silas's jaw tightened slightly. Then he nodded. "Stay." She reached for his hand. "Then tell me who you were before all this." There was the one thing he hadn't given her yet. He took a breath, slow. "After the war, I didn't go back east. I couldn't. I'd seen too much. Tried ranching. Married young, had a son. Then sickness took them both within a month." He paused. "I didn't talk to anyone for a long time after that." Alara didn't flinch. "I can see why. They were good people," he added, "not out of obligation, but because it mattered. But that part of me died with them." Alara nodded. And now his eyes met hers. "Now something's come back." She touched his face, her thumb brushing along the edge of his cheekbone. "I ain't trying to replace them," she said gently. "But I'm not going to vanish either. You don't need to say that. I want to." They stood there a moment longer. Then Alara stepped away, walked to the chest near the bed, and pulled out her folded things, what little remained from before: the torn dress, the shawl, the boots with holes. She turned back to Silas. "I've got no dowry," she said flat. "No land, no name, and you've already seen everything there is to see." He tilted his head. "That's so." Alara came closer, slower now. "I don't want to just stay in your bed. I want to stay in your life." Silas didn't move. "I want to be your wife," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas didn't make a speech, didn't kneel. He just reached for her hand, pulled it gently to his chest, and said, "Then stay." That night they made love again, slower this time, not with caution but with intent. Silas kissed her belly, her thighs, her lips. Alara didn't hide from his gaze. She arched into his hands, held his head between her palms. They whispered each other's names, not like oaths, but like truths they no longer needed to doubt. Later, she lay curled against him, one leg hooked over his hand, resting along the curve of her waist. "Will you tell the town?" she asked. He kissed her shoulder. "They'll figure it out." Alara closed her eyes. "Let them talk." Silas nodded into her skin. "They've talked before," he said. "This time they'll be right." Outside, spring crept a little closer. Inside, the woman who once had 12 doors slammed in her face had finally closed one behind her by choice, and this time she wasn't walking back out. By the first full thaw, everything had changed, though most of it happened quietly. The cabin looked nearly the same from the outside. Smoke still curled from the chimney at dawn. The old gate still leaned on its hinges. But if anyone from Havenwood Ridge rode by, they'd see laundry hung with more regularity, a small garden plot being worked, and a new coat of red paint on the front door. The changes weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were lived in. Alara stood barefoot on the porch that morning, her hands dusted with flour, a loaf of bread baked inside the scent, already reaching past the window. She wore a clean, mended dress, still low-cut, still her own. She hadn't started covering herself just because she was now respectable. Silas had never asked that of her. She was who she'd always been, just safe now. Silas was in the pasture checking the north fence line. He moved with more ease these days. The limp remained, but there was less heaviness to it. He had someone to come back to now, a reason to walk back inside. Inside the cabin, everything had its place. The boy's old wooden horse still sat on the shelf. Alara had dusted it, not hidden it. His wife's sewing kit remained in the chest untouched. Alara hadn't needed to erase the past to build a future. Silas had never asked her to. That afternoon, a knock came at the gate. It was the sheriff. Silas stepped onto the porch, a rifle slung casually in his left hand. Not threatening, but not hiding it either. Alara stood behind him, her arms crossed, calm but ready. "Sorry to come up unannounced," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Had a man come through town a few days back. Preacher type. Said he was looking for a woman." Alara didn't move. Her hands tensed slightly on her arms. Silas didn't speak. The sheriff glanced toward Alara. Said she was his wife. Claimed she stole from him. Town didn't take kindly to him preaching on the street. Silas's voice came low and steady. "He's still around." The sheriff shook his head. Number one of the ranch hands told him if he stepped foot past the general store again, he'd be buried under it. Man left before sundown. Had a look in his eye like he knew he'd already lost. Alara exhaled slowly. The sheriff looked between them. Folks in town heard the talk. They've also seen how quiet things have stayed out here. No one's worried. Silas gave a single nod. "Good." The sheriff tipped his hat again. "You need anything, you send word." He rode off. Silas stepped back inside. Alara didn't follow right away. She stayed on the porch watching the dust settle along the trail. Then, with quiet finality, she closed the front gate. Later that week, they married. Not in a church, not in town. Silas carved 2 rings out of wood from the same pine he used in the porch rail. He didn't give her a speech, just handed it to her one morning while she folded sheets. "You don't need it," he said, "but I'd like you to have it." She smiled. "It fits." The next morning she woke earlier than usual. There was something in her body that had shifted. Not pain, not sickness, just a deep knowing. She waited until he returned from feeding the animals. "I think I'm with child," she said, her voice steady. Silas didn't speak right away. He looked at her long and hard, not with fear, but with something close to awe. "You sure?" She nodded. "As sure as I've ever been." He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her tighter than he ever had. His hands trembled slightly where they pressed against her lower back. Alara felt his breath slow against her shoulder. They didn't speak of names. Not yet. They didn't make plans. But that night, when she lay against him in the quiet, and the fire burned low, Alara whispered something she hadn't said to anyone in years. "I'm happy." Silas kissed her forehead. "So am I." In the months that followed, Havenwood Ridge learned the truth without ever needing to ask. Alara came into town with her chin high and her ring in plain view. No one sneered. No one dared. They saw the way Silas stood beside her and understood. She wasn't passing through. She belonged. She still wore her dresses low cut, her hair long, her shoulders bare in spring. She didn't need to change who she was to be a wife or a mother. And Silas never once asked her to. He only stayed through storms, through silence, through everything. Because the 13th door hadn't just been open. It had been waiting. And this time she wasn't knocking. She was home. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.